other thing that's interesting to look at is, which of these factors are actually under anybody's control. My assessment is that the factors I've shown on this slide with the gray bars are largely outside of the organization's control. That is, if you choose to operate in a real-time embedded space, you're going to have high complexity, and you really can't do anything about that unless you want to get into some other kind of software. Likewise, with execution time constraints, if you're working on internal business systems, you're not going to have much execution time constraint, and you don't have to worry about it. If you're working on real-time embedded software, then guess what? Then unless you want to get out of that line of business, that's kind of what you're stuck with. Same thing for required software reliability. If you want to work on safety critical systems, you're going to have high reliability requirements. It's not really an option. Not only can the project manager not control it, the organization can't control it. Now, it's also interesting to look at with the orange bars, or yellow, I guess the yellow bars, the lighter bars. I think those are within the organization's control. Things like how good are the programmers, how good are the requirements workers, how much staff turnover is there, how many sites do you develop at. Those are things the organization can control, but those are largely outside the control of an individual project manager. And then you go look at which factors an individual project manager can control, and the set's really pretty small, I think. And this is unfortunate because in most organizations, if the organization says, hey, we need to get better, they typically will push the responsibility for getting better down to the individual project manager level, and yet there aren't very many levers that an individual project manager can pull. Most of those levers, most of the most powerful levers are organizational levers that need to be pulled by somebody at the VP level or maybe even the C level in the organization, that is CEO, COO, CFO, that kind of thing. And so it doesn't work very well in this common scenario where the individual project managers basically are given a classic case of responsibility without the authority they need to actually carry it out. Yeah?
I guess I'm kind of confused, okay, but it seems like you're saying that over time now the complexity has increased significantly. And I guess I'm wondering, okay, so there seems to be a correlation between the organization and the project. It's working on a single project that's, getting bigger and bigger, as opposed to the organization has multiple projects working on it, each one of them being tracked by the COCOBO method. And as it gets to a certain point where it seems like as it gets to a certain point, we'll break off and say, this project is too big to manage the way we've been managing. We need to break it down into a smaller organization or something like that. But you're saying that the trend is the 5 million K-locks or 5 million locks of code kind of a thing is the trend of the future?
I'm saying that in the companies that we've worked with for almost 15 years now, this is just the pattern that we see over and over and over again. In an ideal world, yeah, as the project gets more mature, maybe we could break it into multiple products and they'd all stay small. But that's not the pattern we tend to see. The pattern we tend to see is that products and organizations mature essentially in parallel. And as they mature, the code bases for the products get bigger. That's just what they do. Unless you go through a major initiative to throw out a whole bunch of code bases never get smaller. They just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. They grow through accretion over time. So with Word for Windows 1.0, you had 250,000 lines of code for the code base. By the time you look at Word today, you've got, I haven't seen specific published numbers, but somewhere between 5 and 10 million lines of code. So that product itself has gotten bigger, and the organization that needs to support it, of course, has to get bigger as well. And, could Microsoft or any other company just sort of throw everything out and start over and build a new word processor that's 250,000 lines of code again? I suppose in theory they could, but that's just not what we see happen. We see mature organizations just accumulate code, and they accumulate support obligations, and they accumulate legacy requirements, and so that's the pattern that we see.
So what's the driving force of that? Just once you get set in motion, it's going to stay that way?
Well, the driving force is installed customer base, right? You've got, when you don't have an installed customer base, you can do whatever you want. But once you get 1 million customers, you want to really want to keep those 1 million customers. And so that means that as you move the product forward, you don't want to do anything that causes them to say, hey, we're not moving with you. So that essentially means every new version is a superset of the old version. Nobody ever wants to break anything in the old version. And as users, I think we all pretty much agree with that. If Microsoft released a new version of Word and I couldn't, port the text from my last book when I work on my next book, I would be furious about that. I'd never upgrade. So the implication is
they put in all those ribbons, and that's not even architectural change. That's just a fancy front end.
All right, let's move on. Okay, so let's continue our sample of world-class software organizations. McDonnell Detweiler, Canadian company, operates in the aerospace world. They do outsource projects for the aerospace world. I gave a talk based on my book, Software Project Survival Guide, there a few years ago. And before I went in, I asked, is there any particular area you'd like me to focus on? And they said, yes. We really have terrible problems with our estimates, and if there's one thing you could help us with, it would be figuring out how to estimate more accurately. So as we worked our way through the class, which is a general class that touches a lot of different areas, first I looked at what were their estimation practices, and they actually had quite an elaborate approach to estimation, so that didn't seem like the issue. Then we looked at their project management practices. Well, maybe I thought, well, maybe the estimates are good, but they don't follow through with good project management. Well, no, actually, they had good project management. They trained their project managers, which is not that common. And I thought, well, maybe they're just not doing a good job of requirements. They're experiencing a lot of requirements churn, and that undermines what started out as good estimates. And that wasn't the problem. They actually were very rigorous about defining requirements, and probably as rigorous as I'd seen in tracking changes to requirements. And so I thought, well, maybe they're have quality problems. Maybe they are putting a lot of defects in early and not tracking them, but in fact that wasn't true either. They actually were making use of full formal inspections, and they were actually tracking defect phase escape rates, and as it turned out, they were one of the most sophisticated quality organizations I'd ever seen. As we got toward the end of the class, I had to admit that I was running out of ideas about why they might be having such terrible estimation problems. So finally I just asked him. I said, as far as I can tell, you guys are doing an awful lot of things right. How bad are your estimation problems anyway? And they said, well, we might be being a little too hard on ourselves because we do deliver 97% of our projects on time and on budget. That last 3% is just killing us. And having such terrible estimation problems. So finally I just asked him. I said, as far as I can tell, you guys are doing an awful lot of things right. How bad are your estimation problems anyway? And they said, well, we might be being a little too hard on ourselves because we do deliver 97% of our projects on time and on budget. That last 3% is just killing us. And and I've noticed over the years that some of the best organizations are also some of the most self-critical. They actually didn't realize how rare it was to deliver 97% of their projects on time and on budget. As far as they were concerned, the only really acceptable percentage was 100%, and anything short of that would be unacceptable. And they didn't realize that the average organization is an awful lot closer to 0% than 100%. And so, we talked about business solutions to that problem rather than purely technical solutions. But that I had the opposite experience with a company too, where I went in and gave the same class to a group of people. And I was doing this class at 2 sites on 2 consecutive days. I was looking at the feedback from the first class at the end of the first day, and it was pretty critical. A lot of it said, this is pretty basic stuff. We don't really need to hear this. We already know this. So I talked to the VP at the end of the day, and who had brought me in, and said, what do you think? Do I need to change my message? It sounds like this is too basic for these guys. And the VP said, yeah, I know they think that. That's part of the problem I'm dealing with here, is these guys aren't anywhere near as good as they think they are. Let me show you some results. And he showed me a graph that graphed 80 software projects, of which maybe 3 were on time. The average overrun was more than 100%. So in contrast to this organization, where they actually had extremely high on-time delivery percentage, but were still very self-critical, this other organization was really overconfident and rarely delivered anything on time. They were off by more than 100% most of the time, and yet they were perfectly content with their performance. And that's a pattern that we've seen. It's not universal. I wouldn't even characterize it as exceptions. It's not uniform enough to have exceptions, but it's certainly a pattern we've seen that the best organizations are the most self-critical. The worst organizations are often the most overconfident and not introspective at all.